Long before forensic science had labs and detectives had databases, there was a man whose mind could slice through the fog of mystery with a single glance: Sherlock Holmes. By the late 19th century, his name was whispered in drawing rooms and printed on front pages. But Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the physician-turned-author who breathed life into Holmes, often felt trapped by the fame of his own creation. "I am weary of his name," Doyle once admitted, torn between pride and exhaustion. Yet the world refused to let Holmes go. Readers demanded his return, craving more tales of razor-sharp deduction and unshakable pursuit of truth. And so, Doyle continued to weave cases that tested not only Holmes's intellect, but also his resolve. In one such case, The Adventure of Black Peter, Holmes steps into the murky world of greed, violence, and secrets buried deep beneath the surface. It's a story where the stillness of the countryside hides a crime as brutal as any in the city, and where every clue draws the detective closer to a truth both chilling and unforgettable. This is The Adventure of Black Peter. In the year 1895, I never saw my friend in better condition, both in mind and body. His growing fame had brought him an immense workload, and though it would be indiscreet of me to even hint at the identities of some of his distinguished clients, I can say that many prominent figures crossed our modest doorstep in Baker Street. Yet, Holmes, much like any true artist, worked purely for the sake of his craft. Aside from the matter of the Duke of Holderness, I rarely knew him to claim any significant payment for his remarkable services. So detached from worldly gain, or perhaps so whimsically selective, he would often decline the most influential and wealthy clients if their cases failed to spark his interest, while devoting weeks of intense labor to obscure matters brought forward by humble individuals, provided those matters were tinged with the unusual drama that stirred his imagination and challenged his ingenuity. That remarkable year saw him tackle a peculiar range of investigations. They stretched from the high-profile inquiry into the sudden death of Cardinal Tosca, conducted at the personal request of the Pope himself, to the capture of Wilson, the infamous canary trainer, whose arrest cleared a lingering blight from London's East End. But soon after these two notable cases came the tragic affair at Woodman's Lee, along with the strange and shadowy circumstances surrounding the death of Captain Peter Carey. No account of Holmes's career could ever be complete without mention of this singular episode. During the first week of July, Holmes was away from our lodgings so frequently and for such long stretches that I was certain he was engaged in something substantial. My suspicion deepened when several rough-looking men arrived at Baker Street, asking for Captain Basil, one of the many aliases Holmes used in his undercover work. I knew of at least 5 different safe havens scattered across London where he could alter both his appearance and his identity. He told me nothing of his business, and it was never my habit to press him for details. Then, one morning, the first clear sign of his investigation came in the most unexpected way. He returned before breakfast carrying a large, barbed-headed spear tucked under his arm, as casually as one might carry an umbrella. It turned out that he had spent part of the morning at a butcher's shop, testing the weapon against the carcass of a hanging pig, attempting to determine whether it was possible to drive it through with a single blow. His experiment proved it could not be done, at least not by the strength of his own arm, and he speculated that this finding bore some indirect relation to the mystery of Woodman's Lee. At that very moment, Inspector Stanley Hopkins arrived, a sharp, energetic young officer with whom Holmes often collaborated. Holmes had high hopes for him, while the inspector himself regarded Holmes with the admiration of a devoted pupil. Yet on this occasion, Hopkins's expression was heavy with disappointment. He had just returned from a report to his superiors, and by his own admission, the results so far had been a complete failure. This was his first major case, and he confessed that he was at his wit's end, urgently requesting Holmes's help. Holmes explained that he had already studied all the available evidence, including the inquest report, and then asked Hopkins about a tobacco pouch found at the crime scene. Hopkins replied that it belonged to the victim, made of sealskin and bearing his initials, which made sense as Captain Carey had once been a sealer. However, there had been no pipe discovered, an odd fact, given that Carey smoked very little, though perhaps he kept tobacco for his guests. Holmes noted the peculiarity, but remarked that, had the case been his from the beginning, the pouch might have been his first line of inquiry. He then invited Hopkins to recount the essential sequence of events so that I, having heard nothing of the matter until then, could follow the case from the start. Inspector Stanley Hopkins referred to his notes, outlining the life of the late Captain Peter Carey. Born in 1845, Carey was 50 years old at the time of his death. He had been one of the most daring and accomplished seal and whale fishers of his time, commanding the Dundee steam sealer Sea Unicorn in 1883 after several highly successful voyages. The following year, in 1884, he retired from the sea, traveled for a number of years, and eventually purchased a small property called Woodman's Lee near Forest Row in Sussex. He had lived there for 6 years, and it was there, just 1 week earlier, that his life came to its violent end. Carey was a man of striking contradictions. Outwardly, he lived as a stern Puritan, silent and brooding. His household included his wife, his 20-year-old daughter, and 2 female servants who rarely stayed long, as the atmosphere in the home was far from cheerful and at times unbearable. His temper was fueled by drink, and when seized by a drunken fit, he became a violent terror. On more than one occasion, he had driven his wife and daughter from their beds in the dead of night, forcing them through the park under the lash until the villagers outside the gates heard their screams. Once, he had even been summoned to court for a vicious assault on the elderly vicar who dared to rebuke him. By all accounts, Peter Carey was one of the most dangerous men one could encounter, a reputation that had followed him since his seafaring days. Among sailors, he was known as Black Peter, not only for his dark, weathered features and massive beard, but for the fierce moods that made him feared by all who served under him. In the village, his death was met without a single word of mourning. Hopkins went on to explain a curious detail about Carey's living arrangements. A few hundred yards from the main house stood a small wooden hut, what he proudly referred to as his cabin. It measured 16 feet by 10, with curtained windows on each side, one of which faced the high road. The captain slept there every night, keeping the key to himself, making his own bed, cleaning it without help, and allowing no other person to cross its threshold. At night, the glow from his window often drew the curiosity of passers-by, who would wonder aloud what Black Peter was doing inside. One such passerby, a stonemason named Slater, claimed to have seen something peculiar 2 days before the murder. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, he noticed the light burning inside the cabin and, on the drawn blind, the distinct shadow of a man's head. It was bearded, but in a short, bristling style unlike Carey's long, thick beard. Slater was certain the figure was not the captain, though the value of his statement was questionable. He had been drinking for 2 hours beforehand, and the cabin stood some distance from the road. The day before the crime, Carey was in one of his darkest moods, drunk and prowling the house like a dangerous animal. The women fled whenever they heard him coming. Late that evening, he went to his cabin. Around 2 o'clock the following morning, his daughter, whose bedroom window was open, heard a terrible scream from that direction. Yet such outbursts were not unusual when he was in drink, and no one paid it much mind. At dawn, a maid noticed the cabin door standing open, but such was the fear Carey inspired that no one dared to investigate until midday. When at last they peered inside, the sight was so horrific that they ran pale-faced into the village for help. Hopkins arrived within the hour. Even for a man with steady nerves, the scene was deeply unsettling. The small cabin droned with the buzz of flies. The floor and walls splattered like a slaughterhouse. Inside, it was furnished like the quarters of a ship. Bunk at one end, sea chest, charts, logbooks, and a picture of the Sea Unicorn. In the middle sat Peter Carey, his face twisted in the agony of death, his great beard jutting upward. A steel harpoon had been driven clean through his chest, pinning him to the wooden wall behind him. Death had been instantaneous, striking at the very moment he gave that final, terrible cry. Hopkins had carefully examined the ground outside and the floor within before anything was moved. No footprints were visible, and the absence of such traces puzzled him deeply. Yet from the inquest, it was clear that there were still certain objects at the scene that could not be ignored. The young inspector seemed visibly stung by Holmes's quiet but pointed irony. He admitted that it had been a serious mistake not to involve Holmes earlier, but there was no undoing that now. Still, he proceeded to outline the key details from the scene. Foremost among the objects of interest was the harpoon that had ended Peter Carey's life. It had been taken directly from a rack on the wall, where two others still remained, leaving an empty space for the missing third. The weapon stock bore an engraving, SSC Unicorn, Dundee. This strongly suggested that the killing had been committed in a moment of violent rage, the murderer seizing the nearest weapon available. Adding to the mystery was the fact that the crime had occurred around 2 in the morning, yet Carey had been fully dressed, a detail that hinted at a deliberate meeting rather than a random intrusion. This theory was reinforced by the presence of a bottle of rum and 2 dirty glasses on the table, clear evidence that he had been sharing a drink with someone shortly before his death. There was also a tantalus containing brandy and whiskey resting on the sea chest. Though the decanters were untouched and full, its presence still carried a subtle significance. But the real focus shifted to a coarse, sealskin tobacco pouch lying in the very center of the table. The straight-haired skin was bound by a leather thong, and inside the flap were the initials PC. Along with this, there was roughly half an ounce of strong ship's tobacco, perhaps Carey's own supply, or possibly kept for visitors. The final item of note was a drab-covered notebook, worn on the outside and with its pages discolored from age. On the first page were the initials JHN and the year 1883. Inside, on the second page, appeared the printed letters CPR, followed by page after page of numbers. Other sections bore headings such as Argentine, Costa Rica, and San Paulo, each accompanied by long lists of symbols and figures. To the casual observer, they might have appeared to be lists of stock market securities, with JHN perhaps belonging to a broker and CPR standing for client's name. But Holmes, ever precise, considered another possibility, that the letters referred instead to the Canadian Pacific Railway. Stanley Hopkins appeared visibly frustrated. He muttered under his breath and struck his thigh with a clenched fist, clearly blaming himself for an oversight. He explained that the only clue they now needed to solve was the identity behind the initials JHN. He had already gone through the old stock exchange records from 1883, searching both inside the house and among the outside brokers, yet found no one whose initials matched. Still, he believed this clue to be the most important lead in his possession. In his opinion, it was entirely possible that these initials belonged to the second person present during the crime. In other words, the murderer. He further pointed out that the sudden appearance of a document concerning large holdings in valuable securities provided, for the first time, a clear suggestion of a possible motive for the crime. This revelation genuinely took Holmes by surprise. He openly acknowledged the strength of both Hopkins's points, admitting that the notebook, which had not been presented during the inquest, significantly altered his earlier theories. He confessed that his original reconstruction of the crime left no room for such a document. Holmes asked whether any effort had been made to trace the securities listed inside. Hopkins informed him that inquiries were underway, but it was likely the complete shareholder records of these South American companies were stored overseas, meaning it could take weeks before any progress was made. While speaking, Holmes examined the notebook's cover through his magnifying lens. He noticed a slight discoloration, which Hopkins confirmed to be a bloodstain. Hopkins recalled picking the book up from the floor noting that the stain was on the side nearest to the boards, clear evidence that the notebook had been dropped only after the crime had been committed. This led him to conclude it was likely dropped by the murderer in a hurried escape, as it had been found near the door. Holmes then inquired whether any of the securities mentioned had been discovered among the victim's possessions. Hopkins replied in the negative. There was no sign of robbery. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed. However, he did confirm the presence of a sheath knife, still inside its casing, lying at the victim's feet. Mrs. Carey had identified it as belonging to her husband. Holmes fell into a thoughtful silence for a while before remarking that he might need to visit the scene himself. Hopkins's relief was immediate and obvious. This news was clearly a weight off his mind. Yet Holmes cautioned that the investigation would have been much simpler had he been consulted a week earlier. Still, he believed the trip might yield useful results. Turning to me, Holmes invited my company and then instructed Hopkins to arrange for a four-wheeler so that we could depart for Forest Row within 15 minutes. Upon arriving at the small wayside station, we continued our journey for several miles, passing through the scattered remnants of vast old woods. These were once part of the great forest, the impenetrable weald that had for 60 years resisted the Saxon invaders and stood as Britain's bulwark. Much of it had been cleared long ago, for this region was once home to the first ironworks in the country. The ancient trees had been felled to smelt the ore, but in time, the richer fields of the north absorbed the trade, leaving behind nothing but ravaged groves and deep scars in the earth as silent witnesses to the past. In a clearing on the green slope of a hill stood a long, low, stone house, approached by a curving drive that wound through the fields. Closer to the road, and surrounded on three sides by thick bushes, was a small outhouse, its door and single window facing toward us, the very place where the murder had occurred. Stanley Hopkins first led us to the main house, where he introduced us to a haggard, gray-haired woman, the widow of the murdered man. Her gaunt face was deeply lined, her eyes red-rimmed, and behind them lingered a furtive look of terror, signs of long years of hardship and ill usage. With her stood her daughter, a pale, fair-haired young woman whose eyes blazed with defiance. She spoke with startling candor, declaring her gladness at her father's death and even blessing the hand that had struck him down. It was a grim household that Black Peter Carey had ruled over, and stepping back into the sunlight, I felt a distinct sense of relief as we made our way along a worn path across the fields, a path trodden by the footsteps of the dead man himself. The outhouse proved to be a simple structure, wooden walls, a shingle roof, one window beside the door and another on the far side. As Hopkins drew the key from his pocket and bent to unlock it, he stopped abruptly, his attention caught by something amiss. There were fresh marks on the woodwork, deep scratches cutting through the paint to the white surface beneath, as though made only moments before. At the nearby window, further signs of interference were visible. Someone had evidently tried to force an entry, but had failed. The attempt bore the mark of clumsy workmanship, almost laughably poor for a burglar. Hopkins insisted such damage had not been there the previous evening, making it all the more puzzling. The situation suggested a nocturnal visitor who had come expecting an open door, attempted to gain entry with the blade of a very small penknife, and failed. Logic suggested he might return, next time better equipped. It seemed likely that he would indeed try again. Inside the cabin, the traces of the tragedy had been cleared away, but the furniture remained exactly as it had been on the night of the murder. For 2 hours, Holmes moved through the room with deep concentration, examining each object in turn. Yet his expression gradually revealed the lack of success in his search. Only once did he pause to remark upon something unusual, a faintly cleaner patch on a dusty shelf where some item had clearly been removed. Whether it had been a book lying on its side, or perhaps a box, could not be determined. With nothing further to be gained, he set the matter aside. Suggesting we take advantage of the fine day, we wandered into the beautiful surrounding woods, turning our attention for a time to the birds and the flowers, while leaving arrangements to reconvene later and perhaps come face to face with a mysterious nighttime visitor. It was a little past 11 when our small ambuscade took position. Hopkins had been inclined to leave the door of the hut ajar, but Holmes judged this would only awaken the stranger's suspicion. The lock, being a simple one, needed only the pressure of a strong blade to spring it. Holmes further advised that we should not conceal ourselves inside, but instead keep to the shadows among the thick bushes by the farther window. From there, should our quarry strike a light, we might both observe his actions and discover the purpose of his stealthy visit. So began a long, melancholy vigil, carrying with it a strange thrill, like that of the hunter lying hidden beside a waterhole, waiting for the arrival of some thirsty creature of prey. What sort of beast might creep toward us from the darkness? Would it be a fierce predator of crime, one to be taken only after a desperate fight, or some skulking jackal, dangerous only to the weak and unwary? In utter silence we crouched in the damp foliage, eyes fixed upon the hut. At first, stray footsteps of late-returning villagers and the faint murmur of voices from the road broke the stillness. But these interruptions faded one by one, until there remained only the distant chime of the church clock marking the slow march of the night, and the soft rustle of fine rain whispering upon the leaves above us. 2:30 struck, the darkest hour before the dawn, when a sharp, low click came from the direction of the gate. Someone had entered the drive. Silence followed, so deep that I began to suspect a false alarm, until a stealthy step was heard on the far side of the hut. A moment later came the metallic scrape and clink of metal at the lock. This time, whether from superior skill or better tools, the intruder was successful. A sudden snap, a creak of hinges, and the door yielded. A match flared, and an instant later the steady glow of a candle lit the hut's interior. Through the gauze curtain, we fixed our gaze upon the scene within. The visitor was a young man, thin and frail, with a black mustache that heightened the deadly pallor of his face. He could scarcely have been more than 20, and I had never seen a living soul so stricken with fear. His teeth chattered visibly, and his limbs shook uncontrollably. Dressed like a gentleman, in a Norfolk jacket, knickerbockers, and a cloth cap, he cast frightened glances around the room. Placing the stub of his candle on the table, he moved to a corner and returned with a large logbook from a shelf. Leaning over the table, he flipped rapidly through its pages until he found the entry he sought. Then, with a clenched fist raised in anger, he snapped the book shut, returned it to its place, and extinguished the light. He had barely turned toward the door when Hopkins seized him by the collar. A gasp of pure terror escaped the young man as the truth of his capture dawned upon him. The candle was lit once more, and there he stood, shivering, cowering, and utterly helpless, sinking onto his sea chest and staring at us with wide, desperate eyes. Stanley Hopkins confronted the stranger, his tone sharp and demanding, wanting to know the man's identity and purpose for being there. The fellow straightened himself, as if summoning courage, and met our gaze with an effort to remain composed. He acknowledged us as detectives and expressed his belief that we suspected him of involvement in Captain Peter Carey's death. Yet, he insisted on his innocence. Hopkins remained firm, requesting the man's name, and the answer, John Hopley Nelligan, seemed to prompt an unspoken understanding between Holmes and Hopkins, their quick exchange of glances revealing it. Hopkins pressed further, asking his reason for being there. The young man hesitated, wishing to speak in confidence, but was denied. His reluctance was clear, and he questioned why he should share the truth at all. Hopkins warned that silence could work against him when the matter came to trial, and the young man visibly flinched at the thought. At last, he explained, though his voice carried a weight of reluctance. He dreaded reviving an old scandal, yet admitted there was no reason to conceal it now. He asked if we had ever heard of Dawson and Nelligan. Hopkins's puzzled expression betrayed ignorance, but Holmes's interest sharpened instantly. Holmes recognized the name as belonging to a West Country banking firm that had failed for $1 million, ruining half the county families of Cornwall, with Nelligan himself vanishing. The stranger confirmed this, revealing that Nelligan was his father. At last, we seemed to be getting something concrete, though the connection between an absconding banker and Captain Peter Carey, found pinned to the wall with one of his own harpoons, still felt distant. We listened closely as the young man began to explain. He spoke of how it was truly his father who had been involved, as Dawson had already retired. He had been only 10 years old at the time, yet old enough to feel the weight of shame and horror that swept through their family. The world believed his father had stolen a fortune in securities and fled, but he claimed it was not so. His father's intention, he said, was to realize the value of those securities over time, repay every creditor in full, and restore his honor. Just before a warrant for his arrest was issued, the man had set out in a small yacht bound for Norway. The young man remembered that last night vividly, the farewell to his mother, the list of securities left behind, and the promise that he would return with his name cleared, leaving no one to suffer for trusting him. But from that night onward, nothing was ever heard again. Both yacht and man vanished, and for years, the young man and his mother believed they lay somewhere at the bottom of the sea. It was only through the diligence of a loyal family friend, a businessman, that they learned some of those very securities had resurfaced on the London market. Shocked, the young man devoted months to tracing them, eventually discovering that the original seller had been none other than Captain Peter Carey, owner of the isolated hut in which this whole case began. Naturally, he had investigated the captain and learned that Carey had commanded a whaler returning from the Arctic at the same time his father would have been sailing toward Norway. That autumn had been marked by fierce southerly gales, and it seemed possible his father's yacht had been blown northward, perhaps crossing paths with Carey's vessel. If so, what had happened to him? The young man believed that if he could prove, through Carey's records, how the securities had come to market, it would clear his father of wrongdoing. He had traveled to Sussex intending to speak to Carey, only to find the man had met a violent end. Reading a description of the captain's cabin at the inquest, he learned it still contained the old logbooks of his vessel. It struck him that if he could examine the log for August 1883, the month his father disappeared, he might finally solve the mystery. He had tried the night before to enter the cabin but failed. On the second attempt, he had succeeded, only to find the crucial pages missing. It was at that moment, he said, that he was caught. Hopkins pressed him further, producing a small notebook bearing the man's initials on the first page and marked with a faint bloodstain on the cover. The sight seemed to break him. His face sank into his hands, his body trembling. He admitted he believed he had lost it at his hotel, unaware it had been found here. Hopkins, satisfied, placed him under arrest, insisting that anything more he had to say must be told in court. He thanked Holmes and myself for our presence, though he remarked that he could have brought the matter to its successful conclusion without our help. The next morning, as we traveled back, Holmes asked for my thoughts. I could see he was not satisfied, though he claimed otherwise. He remarked that Hopkins's methods disappointed him, and that a good investigator should always consider and prepare for a possible alternative explanation. Holmes hinted that he had been pursuing just such an alternative line of inquiry, uncertain whether it would bear fruit, but determined to follow it through. Upon our return to Baker Street, several letters awaited Holmes. One in particular lit his face with a triumphant smile. Declaring that the alternative was unfolding, he dictated 2 telegrams, one summoning 3 men from a shipping agent, the other inviting Inspector Hopkins to breakfast the following morning. Holmes announced that the case, which had haunted him for 10 days, was now banished from his mind until its final resolution. The next morning, precisely on time, Hopkins arrived, and we all sat down to the excellent breakfast Mrs. Hudson had prepared. The young detective was in high spirits, savoring the satisfaction of what he believed to be a successful case. Holmes questioned whether the solution laid out by Hopkins could truly be correct. Hopkins, in turn, expressed complete confidence, insisting that he could not imagine a case more complete or conclusive. He outlined his reasoning in detail. Young Nelligan had arrived at the Bramblety Hotel on the very day of the crime, under the guise of playing golf. His room, situated on the ground floor, allowed him to come and go as he pleased. That very night, Hopkins believed Nelligan had gone to Woodman's Lee, encountered Peter Carey in his hut, quarreled with him, and in a moment of deadly violence, struck him down with a harpoon. Horrified by what he had done, the young man had fled, accidentally dropping the notebook he had intended to use to question Carey about the securities, some of which had been marked with ticks, while the majority had not. Hopkins explained that the ticked ones had been traced to the London market, while the rest were presumably still in Carey's possession. According to Nelligan's own account, he was eager to recover them in order to honor his father's creditors. Hopkins concluded that after his initial flight, Nelligan had avoided the hut for some time, only to eventually force himself to return in search of the missing information. Holmes listened patiently, then smiled faintly and shook his head. He pointed out that the entire theory was undermined by one crucial impossibility. Driving a harpoon through a human body required immense strength and practice. Holmes himself had spent an entire morning testing the matter, and even with his skill it had been no simple task. Yet the blow that killed Carey had driven the weapon's head deep into the wall. Could such a frail, nervous youth have managed such a feat? Was he the type to sit drinking rum with Black Peter in the dead of night, or the man whose profile had been glimpsed through the blind 2 nights earlier? Holmes declared that the true culprit must be another, far more formidable figure. Hopkins's confidence faltered as Holmes spoke, though he stubbornly maintained that Nelligan's presence at the hut on the night of the crime was beyond dispute. The notebook would prove it, and Hopkins felt certain he had enough evidence to convince a jury. As for this mysterious, formidable person Holmes suggested, Hopkins demanded to know where such a man could be found. Holmes answered calmly that he suspected the individual was even now on the stairs, and quietly suggested I keep my revolver within reach. Rising, he placed a written paper on a side table, announcing that we were ready. Outside, muffled voices spoke in deep, rough tones, and Mrs. Hudson appeared to say that 3 men were asking for Captain Basil. Holmes instructed that they be shown in, one by one. The first to enter was a small, apple-cheeked fellow with soft white side whiskers. Holmes inquired after his name, learned it was James Lancaster, and politely dismissed him, offering a half-sovereign for his trouble and directing him to wait in another room. The second was a long, gaunt figure with lank hair and sallow skin, named Hugh Paddens. He, too, was dismissed in the same manner. The third man, however, was striking in both build and presence, a face like that of a bulldog, framed by a wild tangle of hair and beard, with 2 fierce, dark eyes shining beneath heavy, tufted brows. He saluted in the manner of a sailor, turning his cap slowly in his hands. Holmes began questioning the third man, learning that his name was Patrick Cairns, a harpooner by trade with 26 voyages behind him. He hailed from Dundee and was ready to join an exploring vessel at short notice, asking for £8 a month in wages. He confirmed that he could leave as soon as he had gathered his kit and produced his papers, worn and greasy from years at sea, which Holmes inspected briefly before returning. Holmes told him he was exactly the man needed, pointing to an agreement on the side table and inviting him to sign. The seaman stepped forward and bent over the table to write. In that instant, Holmes leaned over his shoulder, slipping both hands quickly around his neck. With a sudden click of steel, a roar like an enraged bull filled the room, and the next moment Holmes and the man were grappling violently on the floor. Cairns possessed immense strength, and even with the handcuffs locked securely around his wrists, it was clear he would overpower Holmes unless Hopkins and I intervened. We rushed forward, and only when I pressed the cold barrel of my revolver against his temple did he realize resistance was useless. His ankles were bound with cord, and at last we could catch our breath after the fierce struggle. Holmes, calm once more, apologized to Hopkins for the disruption, jesting that while the scrambled eggs might now be cold, the satisfaction of having the case concluded would surely make breakfast all the more enjoyable. Hopkins, however, was struck dumb with astonishment. When he finally found his voice, he admitted with some embarrassment that he had been misled from the very start, recognizing Holmes as the master and himself as the pupil. He confessed that he understood what Holmes had accomplished, but still had no idea how it had been done or what it meant. Holmes, good-humored as ever, explained that the key lesson was never to lose sight of an alternative explanation. Hopkins had been so fixed upon young Nelligan that he had spared no thought for Patrick Cairns, the real killer of Peter Carey. At that point, Cairns's deep, hoarse voice cut in. He declared that while he made no complaint about being restrained, he wanted the truth of the matter to be spoken plainly. He did not call him murder, though others might. According to him, he had known Black Peter, and when Carey drew a knife, he acted instantly, driving a harpoon into him, fully aware it was either Carey's life or his own. That, he said, was how the man died, and he would just as soon hang as be left to die with Carey's blade in his heart. Holmes had inquired how the man had come to be there, and the reply unfolded into a grim confession that began decades earlier, in August of 1883. At that time, Peter Carey commanded the whaling vessel Sea Unicorn, and the speaker served as the spare harpooner. They were emerging from the ice pack, battling headwinds and a week-long southerly gale, when their ship came across a small craft blown far to the north. On board was only one man, a landsman. His crew had abandoned him, attempting to reach the Norwegian coast in a dinghy, and were presumed drowned. The stranger was taken aboard, and over the next days, he spent long hours in private conversation with Carey. His only possession was a single tin box. The man's name, so far as the harpooner knew, was never mentioned. Then, on the second night, the stranger vanished entirely. Officially, it was said he had either jumped or fallen overboard during the rough weather. But the harpooner had seen the truth with his own eyes, Carey tipping the man over the rail in the dead of night, 2 days before the Shetland lights were sighted. The harpooner kept his knowledge to himself. Upon returning to Scotland, the matter was quietly hushed up. No one asked questions about the accidental death of a stranger. Carey soon left the sea, and many years passed before his former crewmate discovered his whereabouts. Suspecting that Carey had killed the man for whatever was in that tin box, the harpooner decided the time had come to collect payment for his silence. He tracked Carey down through another sailor who had met him in London. The first night's meeting went well enough. Carey agreed to terms that could have freed the harpooner from a life at sea forever, with arrangements to finalize matters 2 nights later. But when that evening came, Carey was heavily drunk and in a foul temper. They sat together, drinking and reminiscing, but the more alcohol Carey consumed, the more dangerous his expression became. A harpoon hung on the wall, and the harpooner silently noted its presence, sensing it might be needed. Suddenly, Carey erupted, spitting curses, eyes blazing with murderous intent, clasping a great knife in his hand. Before he could even draw it from its sheath, the harpooner struck. Carey's cry was unforgettable, his face haunting the harpooner's nights ever since. Standing over the body, blood pooling around him, the harpooner waited, but no one came. Taking heart, he noticed the tin box on the shelf, claimed it, and left, carelessly forgetting his tobacco pouch on the table. The strangest twist came moments later. Just outside the hut, footsteps approached, forcing him to hide among the bushes. A man crept in, only to give a cry of shock before fleeing at full speed. Who the intruder was, or why he had come, remained unknown. The harpooner then walked 10 miles, caught a train at Tunbridge Wells, and reached London undetected. But the tin box held no money, only papers he dared not attempt to sell. His leverage over Black Peter was gone, leaving him penniless in London. With no choice, he returned to his trade. Seeing advertisements for harpooners at high wages, he applied through shipping agents and was sent to his current position. He declared that if he had indeed killed Black Peter, the law should thank him for saving the cost of a rope. Holmes considered the statement clear and advised Hopkins to secure the prisoner, as the room was no proper cell. Hopkins expressed gratitude, still puzzled at Holmes's deduction. Holmes explained that from the beginning, every clue, immense strength, skill with a harpoon, the rum and water habit, the sealskin tobacco pouch with coarse tobacco, pointed to a whaler. He dismissed the pouch's PC initials as coincidence, knowing Carey rarely smoked. Even the choice of rum over whiskey or brandy was telling, true to a seaman's taste. The only ship Carey had sailed on was the Sea Unicorn, so Holmes obtained the 1883 crew list from Dundee. Patrick Cairns, a harpooner, emerged as the obvious suspect, likely in London and seeking to leave the country. Holmes then staged an Arctic expedition to lure such men, leading directly to the arrest. Hopkins marveled, but Holmes urged the release of young Nelligan and the return of the tin box. The lost securities, however, were gone forever. With the matter closed, Holmes noted that if needed for the trial, both he and I would be somewhere in Norway. And so, with his trademark blend of keen observation and quiet certainty, Holmes unraveled yet another mystery. From the very first clue, the harpoon on the wall, the coarse tobacco, the sailor's drink, he had been quietly steering toward the truth as a seasoned captain guides a ship through hidden waters. It was never luck. It was vision, the kind that sees what others pass by, weaving together a complete story from the smallest of fragments. Black Peter's grim fate, the hidden past of the tin box, and the freedom of an innocent man. Each thread was tied neatly, as Holmes always managed to do. Once again, I found myself marveling at how simple the answer seemed after he revealed it. That is his genius, turning tangled puzzles into clear truths. If you enjoyed walking these shadowed paths of mystery and deduction, I welcome you to return for more journeys into the world of Sherlock Holmes, right here on Echoes of Stories. Your support, by subscribing, sharing, and leaving your thoughts, keeps these echoes alive for every listener who loves the thrill of a good tale. Until our next adventure, farewell.